The candle had burned down to a nub 3 times over the years, and every time it guttered out, Perry Walker simply lit another one and set it back in the same window, because some promises a man makes to himself are harder to break than the ones he makes out loud. It was the spring of 1878 when Stella Bailey first rode into Caldwell, Kansas, and Perry Walker first laid eyes on her from across the dusty Main Street, where the wind came howling down off the open plains with the kind of force that made a man brace his boots wide and tuck his chin. She had come in on the afternoon stage from Wichita, sitting up on the box beside the driver, because she said the inside of that coach smelled like old boots and someone else's sorrow, and she was not about to spend 6 hours breathing either. The driver, a weathered old man named Creed Holloway, had laughed so hard he nearly lost his hat, and that laughter had drawn Perry's attention from where he stood outside the feed store, a 50-pound sack of grain balanced across one shoulder, watching the stage roll in like he did most afternoons out of habit and perhaps a little loneliness. She was 22 years old, with dark auburn hair that the wind had pulled loose from its pins so that it streamed behind her like a battle flag, and she wore a practical brown traveling dress with dust on the hem and fire in her eyes. Perry Walker was 26 and had been running his family's cattle ranch outside of town for 3 years since his father had passed, and he had long since stopped expecting anything surprising to come rolling into Caldwell on the afternoon stage. He was wrong about that. She landed on the ground with a lightness that surprised him, given how long she'd been riding, and then she turned and looked directly at him as if she had felt his gaze the way you feel a hand placed on your shoulder. She did not look away immediately. Neither did he. The grain sack on his shoulder suddenly felt like it weighed considerably more. "That's Stella Bailey," old Creed said from up on his box, loud enough for anyone in the street to hear, because Creed had no particular regard for subtlety. "She's come to take over her aunt's millinery shop. The aunt went back east last month on account of her lungs." Perry had nodded like this was just ordinary information, but he held it the way you hold a coin you found on the road, turning it over and over in his fingers all the way home. The millinery shop sat 3 doors down from the general store on Main Street, and over the following weeks, Perry Walker found himself in need of supplies at a frequency that would have been alarming to anyone keeping track of his household accounts. He bought 3 pairs of gloves he did not need, a tin of tobacco he did not smoke, and enough nails to build a second barn. Each time he went in for the nails or the tobacco or the gloves he did not smoke, he found some reason to walk slowly past the millinery, and sometimes he stopped to look in the window at the hats arranged on their stands, and sometimes Stella Bailey was there behind the glass looking back at him with an expression that lived somewhere between amusement and invitation. She started the conversation that eventually mattered. It was a Tuesday in late June, hot enough that the air above the street shimmered like water, and Perry was walking past with his unnecessary nails when she appeared in the doorway of her shop and said, "You have been past this window 11 times in the last 2 weeks, and you have not once come inside. Either you are planning to rob me, or you are hoping I will do something interesting." He stopped walking. His heart performed a maneuver he could not have described. "I was just passing," he said, which was approximately the least convincing thing he had ever said in his life. "You passed 4 times last Thursday alone," she said. "I counted." He looked at her for a moment, this woman standing in her doorway with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a length of ribbon looped over one hand, and he thought that honesty was probably the only thing that could save him now. "I expect I was hoping you would do something interesting," he said. She smiled then, a full and unguarded smile, and said, "Well, come inside and I will see what I can do." He went inside and he never really left, not in the ways that mattered. They spent that summer learning each other at a pace that felt both urgent and deliberate, the way a river both rushes and takes its time about reaching the sea. He came by the shop on evenings when she was closing up, and they walked together along the edges of town, where the prairie opened up wide and enormous and golden in the late light. And they talked about everything and nothing with the ease of two people who have been slightly lonely for a long time without fully knowing it. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a printer, and she had come west partly because of her aunt's shop, and partly because she had a restlessness in her that the city had never managed to satisfy. Perry had grown up on this Kansas plain and loved it with the deep, uncomplicated love of a man who had never needed to leave something to know it was his. They were different in the way that compliments are different, the way a key is different from a lock, and by August, he was in love with her so thoroughly that the state of his heart had become the primary fact of his existence. He told her so on a warm evening in September, sitting on the porch steps of the ranch house with the stars beginning to come out above the flat horizon. He did not have a speech prepared, which was probably for the best. He simply said, "Stella, I am in love with you and I have been since approximately your second week in town, and I believe I would like to spend considerable time with you going forward, in whatever form you would find acceptable." She had been quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to make his stomach do something uncomfortable, and then she said, "Perry Walker, I am going to be honest with you because you deserve that. I am not ready to settle. I mean that in the most literal sense. There are things I want to see and things I need to understand about myself before I can be what you deserve, and I do not want to give you half a person." He had not said anything immediately, because he was busy absorbing the fact that she had not said she did not love him, only that she was not ready, and those two things were separated by a distance he thought he could wade across. "I understand," he said at last. "Do you?" She asked, and she turned to look at him with those sharp and honest eyes that he had come to love along with everything else about her. "Because I mean it. I do not know how long I will need. I might need years. I'm not asking you to wait for me." "I know you are not asking," he said. "That is my own decision to make." She looked at him for a long time, and there was something in her face that he could not quite read, something complicated and tender and sad all at once. "You should not wait," she said softly. "That is my honest advice to you, Perry. You should not wait." He had simply nodded, which she might have taken as agreement but which he understood as acknowledgement, and those two things are not the same. She left Caldwell in early October of 1878, having found a woman in town named Dorothea Crane who wanted to buy the millinery shop and who had the funds to do so. Stella packed her 2 trunks and her hat boxes, and she hugged old Creed Holloway, who wept unashamedly on the stage platform. And she shook hands with the women of the town who had come to admire and befriend her in the months she had been among them. When she got to Perry, she held his hand in both of hers for a moment, and she said, "You are a good man and a fine one, and you deserve every happiness this world has to offer." "So do you," he said. "I intend to go looking for it," she said, and then she climbed up onto the stage because she had again refused the interior, and she rode away toward the south and a westbound connection at the junction. And Perry Walker stood in the street and watched until the stage had gone so far that the dust it kicked up had settled back down to nothing. That evening he came home to his ranch house, which suddenly felt very large and very quiet in the way that spaces feel large and quiet when someone has recently been present and is now gone. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he went to the window that faced east, the direction she had departed, and he lit a candle and set it on the sill. He did not think very clearly about why he did it. It was not a rational act. It was the kind of act that comes from some part of a person that lives below reason, the part that is ruled by feeling and by hope, and by the stubborn refusal to completely let go of what might still come back. He told himself it was just light. He told himself it was just habit, but he lit it every evening after that, and when it burned down he lit another, and by the end of the first year it had become as much a part of his evening routine as feeding the horses and checking the fences. The years began to pass. Caldwell itself was changing around him. The cattle drives that came up the Kisham Trail had been the lifeblood of towns like this one for years, and by the late 1870s and into the 1880s, the trails were still running, but the farmers were pushing in from the east with their barbed wire and their plows, and there was a slow and constant friction between the cattlemen and the homesteaders that produced more than a little trouble. Perry navigated this landscape with the care of a man who understood that the world was shifting under his feet, that the open-range cattle business his father had built was going to require adaptation to survive, and he threw himself into the work of that adaptation with an energy that some people recognized as genuine industry and others, who looked more carefully, understood as a man filling his hours so that certain thoughts could not take root. He had good friends in Caldwell. There was Frank Dolan, who ran the livery stable and who had been Perry's closest companion since boyhood, a big, red-faced Irishman with a laugh that carried across 3 city blocks and a genuinely terrible singing voice that he deployed without shame at every available opportunity. There was Doc Adler, the town physician, a precise and quiet man from Pennsylvania who had come west for reasons he never fully explained, and who played chess with Perry on Sunday evenings with the concentration of a general planning a campaign. And there was Martha Gaines, who kept the boarding house and who had appointed herself the town's primary agent of matchmaking with a determination and a lack of subtlety that would have been exhausting if she had not been so fundamentally kind about it. Martha tried, over the years, to introduce Perry to various suitable women. There was a schoolteacher from Ohio who arrived in 1880 and who was intelligent and warm and pretty and interested in Perry in a way that was clear to everyone in Caldwell except, apparently, Perry himself. There was a rancher's daughter from the next county over who could rope a steer as well as any cowhand and who found Perry's quiet manner restful rather than disappointing. There was a widow from Wichita who had the kind of practical competence that the frontier demanded and who would have made any sensible man a good partner. Perry was always kind. Perry was always decent. Perry was never available, not truly, not in the place inside a person where availability actually lives. Frank Dolan pointed this out to him one evening in the spring of 1881. Sitting on the porch of the ranch house with a bottle of rye between them and the prairie going dark and enormous in every direction. "You are aware," Frank said, in the measured tone he used when he was about to say something he knew Perry would not want to hear, "that you have been in love with a woman who has been gone for going on 3 years, and that you light a candle in that window every single night." "I am aware of both of those things," Perry said. "And does this seem like a reasonable way to conduct a life?" "It seems like the way I am conducting mine," Perry said. Frank was quiet for a moment, taking a long pull from his glass. "She told you not to wait," he said. "She did. And yet here you are waiting." "Here I am," Perry agreed without apparent distress. Frank set his glass down and looked at his friend with the particular expression of a man who has lost an argument he made good points in. "Well," he said at last, "I suppose it is your window and your candle." "That is exactly right," Perry said. What Perry did not tell Frank, because there were things a man kept to himself not out of secrecy, but out of privacy, was that he had received 3 letters from Stella Bailey over the years since she had left. They came irregularly from different places, and they were not love letters, not in any direct sense, but they were something. The first had come from Denver in the winter of 1879. A brief letter that spoke of the mountains and the shock of altitude after a lifetime on flat ground, and asked after the town and the people in it with a specificity that meant she had been thinking about them. The second had come from San Francisco in 1880, longer than the first, full of astonished observations about the ocean and the Chinese Quarter and the hills that made getting anywhere a project in itself. The third, in late 1881, came from a town in the New Mexico territory called Las Vegas. Not the Las Vegas anyone would know much later, but a small railroad town on the Santa Fe line, where she said she had stopped for what was supposed to be a week, and had turned into 3 months, because she had found work at a dress shop run by a Mexican woman named Carmen, who was teaching her embroidery techniques that did not exist in the millinery business she had known. Each letter was signed with her full name, Stella Bailey, in the clear and slightly slanted hand he had come to know from the few notes she had left him during the months of their friendship in Caldwell. He kept all three in a tin box in the drawer of his bedside table, and he had read each of them enough times to have them memorized without having tried. He had written back to each address, though he had no certainty the letters reached her, since she might have moved on before they arrived. He wrote honestly and simply, describing the ranch and the town and the people, and he did not say that he loved her or that he was waiting because she had told him not to, and he respected that even if he could not quite manage to act on it. The year 1882 brought new trouble to the region, as troubles had a way of arriving in the West with the regularity of seasons. The cattle business was under pressure from multiple directions. The Kansas legislature was tightening quarantine laws against Texas cattle on account of the tick fever they carried, and the barbed wire was going up faster now, cutting the old trails into sections, and the price of beef had dropped, and there were men in the business who were getting desperate in ways that produced trouble for everyone around them. Two ranchers east of Caldwell, brothers named Holt, had begun running cattle across grazing land that was not theirs and daring their neighbors to object, and the objections when they came were met with threats, and once with a rifle shot fired at a fence post in a manner designed to make clear what the next target might be. Perry Walker was not directly involved in the Holt business, his land being to the west of town, but the anxiety it produced in the community was general, and he felt it like a weather change in his bones. He attended the meetings at the town hall where the ranchers and the farmers and the merchants argued about how to handle the situation, and he said what he thought clearly and without heat, which was that the law needed to be applied even-handedly, and that men who used intimidation to take what was not theirs needed to face consequences for it, and that the alternative was a breakdown of the order that made any of their lives workable. The Holt brothers did not attend these meetings. Sheriff Tom Birch, a competent and courageous man who had been managing Caldwell's considerable lawlessness problems since 1879, dealt with the Holt situation in the spring of 1882 with warrants and deputies, and a patience that eventually produced compliance, and the immediate crisis passed, though the underlying tensions did not, because they were the product of forces larger than any two brothers or any one town sheriff could resolve. Perry watched all of this with the attention of a man who understood that his way of life was in genuine transition, and he made the adaptations he needed to make, leasing some of his grazing land to a homesteader family named Bowen who needed pasture and who were good people, and investing in improvements to his water situation, because water in western Kansas was going to become more valuable as more people arrived. He was, in these years, a competent and respected rancher, a valued member of the community, a good neighbor, a reliable friend. He was, by all visible measures, a man doing well. He still lit the candle every evening and set it in the window that faced east. Frank Dolan, who had by now given up active objection in favor of a kind of fond exasperation, had taken to referring to it simply as the situation, when he spoke to Doc Adler about it, and Doc Adler, who had seen a considerable range of human behavior in his years of medicine, said only that he had known men to keep stranger faiths for longer, and that in his professional opinion Perry was otherwise healthy in body and mind, and ought to be left to his own decisions. Which was the same advice Frank had arrived at independently, and which both men followed. In the autumn of 1882, a letter arrived that was different from the others. It was longer, for one thing, several pages of Stella's slanted handwriting on thin paper that crinkled when he unfolded it. It came from Tucson, in the Arizona Territory, and it had taken nearly 3 weeks to reach him. He read it at the kitchen table in the evening light with the candle burning in its window behind him, and what it said rearranged something inside him that had been arranged a certain way for 4 years. She had been traveling for 4 years, the letter said, and she had seen things she had needed to see, and she had learned things about herself that she had needed to learn. And she was grateful for all of it, truly grateful, because she understood now in a way she had not understood before who she was and what she was capable of, and what she wanted from the world. She had worked in a dress shop in New Mexico and taught school briefly in Colorado, and cooked in a hotel kitchen in Arizona, and she had been sick with fever in the spring, and a woman in the town where she had been staying had nursed her through it. A stern and capable woman named Agnes who had looked at Stella during her recovery with the kind of look that strips away nonsense and said, "You are running from something or towards something, and you had better figure out which before you run yourself into the ground." Stella wrote that she had spent considerable time with that question and had arrived at an answer that had startled her with its simplicity and its certainty. She had been running toward herself, and she thought she had found what she was looking for, or enough of it to know it was time to stop running. And then there was a paragraph that he read 3 times before he believed he was reading it correctly. She wrote, "I think about Caldwell with a frequency that I have stopped trying to explain away. I think about the people there who were kind to me. I think about the prairie in the evening, which I have seen compared with mountains and oceans and desert, and have found that none of them do to my heart what that flat gold horizon does. I think about you, Perry Walker, with a specificity and a regularity that I believe you deserve to know about. I'm not making you a promise in this letter. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm only telling you honestly that when I try to imagine where I belong, my imagination keeps arriving in the same place." He set the letter down on the table and put both of his hands flat on the wood and looked at the candle in the window for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and wrote back. He wrote, "Stella, I am here. I am glad you are well. I am glad you found what you needed to find. The ranch is standing and the prairie is still gold in the evenings. Come whenever you are ready. There is no hurry and there is no condition. I am here." He sent it to the Tucson address, not knowing if she was still there, not knowing if it would reach her. He lit another candle and put it in the window and went to bed. She did not come immediately. She did not come in the winter of 1882 or the spring of 1883. Another letter arrived in June of 1883, this one from New Mexico again, a town called Socorro, and it was brief, just a page. But it was warm in a way her earlier letters had not been, warm in the direct and unguarded way that a person is warm when they have stopped protecting themselves from their own feelings. She said she was making her way north and east in stages, and that she had some business to attend to in Albuquerque before she could continue. She said she had received his letter in Tucson 2 weeks after she had left, forwarded by the hotel where she had been staying, and that she had read it several times on a stage coach going north through the desert, and that it had made her cry in a way she had not cried in a long time, not from sadness but from the particular feeling of being known, which she had decided was one of the most valuable things one person could give another. Perry read this letter on his porch in the June morning, with the grassland around him, going from green to gold as the season advanced, and he felt something that he could only describe as a kind of patient joy, the joy of a man who has held on to something across a long, cold distance and can now feel the warmth of it returning. The summer of 1883 was hot even by Kansas standards, the kind of heat that sat on the land like a physical weight, and made the cattle stand in the creek bottoms all afternoon, and made the horses short-tempered, and made the men working the range come in at midday and sit in whatever shade they could find. Perry's ranch hands, 3 of them now, a quiet Texan named Roy Sims, a young man of 20 called Davis who had come up from Oklahoma, and who was still learning the cattle business in the way that young men learn things, with enthusiasm slightly ahead of skill, and an older man named Benito Salazar who had been born in Santa Fe, and who knew more about horses than anyone Perry had ever met. They all worked hard and well. And Perry worked alongside them with a directness and a lack of pretension that they respected. He told no one about the letters or what they meant, not even Frank, though Frank had noticed a change in Perry's manner that he described to Doc Adler as the look of a man who knows something you don't, and which he found both hopeful and slightly mysterious. In August, a situation arose that required Perry's attention and nearly required his life. One of the Holt brothers, the younger one named Cal, who had never really accepted the resolution of the previous year's dispute, had gotten it into his head that Perry's western fence line encroached on a strip of land that he claimed was his by virtue of an old and dubious survey. This was not accurate, as Perry's land deed and 2 subsequent surveys made clear, but Cal Holt was not a man who let accuracy stand in the way of grievance, and he showed up one afternoon with 2 hired men and a set of wire cutters and began dismantling Perry's fence. Perry rode out when Roy came to tell him what was happening, and he arrived at the fence line to find Cal Holt in a foul and aggressive state, the kind that whiskey and a long-nursed wrong can produce in a man who is not particularly reasonable when sober. The conversation that followed was tense and largely unproductive, and at one point Cal made a move toward the pistol at his hip that caused Perry's heart to stop for a full beat, and then pound forward again at twice the normal rate. It was Roy Sims, sitting his horse 30 feet away with his rifle across the saddle and his face entirely calm, who said in a voice so quiet, and even that it was more frightening than any shout, "I would leave that iron where it is, Mr. Holt." Cal looked at Roy and at the rifle and at Perry, and then he looked at his own 2 hired men who were both quite clearly deciding that they were not being paid enough for whatever this was becoming, and he said several things that were unpleasant, but then he got back on his horse and left. Perry reported the incident to Sheriff Birch, who had a conversation with Cal Holt that apparently made an impression, because the fence line was left alone after that, and Cal Holt's attentions turned elsewhere. But Perry had felt the nearness of it, the way you feel the wind of something passing close, and it reminded him, as such things do, that life was not guaranteed to continue in any particular direction for any particular duration. He thought about Stella Bailey in a different key after that, not just with the patient joy he had been carrying, but with a kind of urgency that he had been careful not to let himself feel. He thought about all the things he had not said and might not have the chance to say, and he understood that patience was a virtue, but that it could become a cage if you let it. He wrote her one more letter, this time to the Albuquerque address she had given him in her last correspondence, and in this letter he was more direct than he had allowed himself to be in any of the previous ones. He said that he wanted her to know that his feelings had not changed in 5 years, and that he did not expect them to change, and that he was not writing to put pressure on her or to ask her to be anything other than what she was ready to be, but that he would be a lesser man if he did not tell her plainly that she was loved, that she had been loved for 5 years, and that whatever she decided about her life and her future, she should know that. He sent the letter and waited, which was something he had considerable practice at. October came, and with it the first real cold, the kind that came down out of the north and turned the sky a hard, flat blue and made the prairie grass lie down close to the earth. The cattle needed to be moved to the winter pastures, and there was fence work to be done and hay to be secured, and Perry drove himself and his ranch hands through it all with the focused energy of a man who has learned that work is the best companion for uncertainty. It was on a Thursday in the middle of October, 1883, that Frank Dolan appeared at the ranch in the early afternoon, which was unusual enough that Perry set down what he was doing and looked at his friend with attention. Frank was on horseback rather than in his wagon, which meant he had come at speed rather than on his regular rounds, and his expression was the expression of a man carrying news he is not sure how to deliver. "She's here," Frank said. Perry straightened from the fence post he had been securing. The hammer in his hand felt suddenly heavy. "What did you say?" "Stella Bailey is in Caldwell," Frank said. "She came in on the noon stage. She is at Martha Gaines' boarding house. I was at the livery when the stage came in. I recognized her." He paused. "She asked after you." Perry set the hammer down very carefully on top of the fence post. He was aware that his hands had a slight tremor in them that he did not usually have. "She asked after me," he repeated. "Said your name very calmly, as if she had been practicing it," Frank said. "Asked if you were still in Caldwell, still running the ranch." He paused again, watching Perry's face with the attention of a man who has waited a long time to witness something. "I told her yes, on both counts." She nodded like that was the answer she was hoping for, and asked which room Martha had available. Perry took the hammer back off the fence post, looked at it for a moment, and then set it down again. He pulled off his work gloves. He looked at the sky, which was that hard, flat blue of October, and the prairie around him, which he loved, and then he looked at Frank and said, "I need to clean up." Frank smiled, the kind of smile that holds 5 years of patient observation in it. "I would say so," he said. "You have fence on you." Perry washed his face and hands at the pump and changed his shirt and ran a comb through his hair. And he thought about riding into town on his horse, but decided to walk, because walking would give him time to find some version of composure that was not simply the wild beating of his heart. The walk into Caldwell from the ranch was about 1.5 miles across the flat prairie, and he had walked it several hundred times over the years, and never once noticed it the way he noticed it now. The way the short grass moved in the cold wind, the way the sky went enormous above him, the way Caldwell sat on the flat earth ahead of him like a modest and beloved fact. He went to Martha Gaines' boarding house, which was a 2-story frame building on the north end of Main Street with a porch that ran the full width of the front and flower boxes that Martha kept alive through sheer stubbornness well into November every year. He knocked on the door and Martha opened it, and she looked at him with an expression so thoroughly composed of satisfaction and restrained emotion that he had to look away from it. "Room 3, Martha said. "She is expecting you." "She is." "I may have sent a boy over to the ranch," Martha said without any apparent guilt whatsoever. He climbed the stairs and stood outside room 3 and knocked twice with a knuckle lightly, the way you knock when you are trying to be calm and are not quite succeeding. There was a brief pause, and then the door opened, and she was there. 5 years had changed her and not changed her. She was thinner than she had been, and there were lines around her eyes that had not been there before, the lines of weather and movement and experience. And her hair was still that dark auburn, but she wore it differently now, less primly than she had in the millinery days. She was 27 years old, and she looked like a woman who had seen a great deal and had been shaped by it without being diminished by it. She looked like herself, only more completely so. She looked at him and he looked at her, and several things happened in that moment that neither of them would have been able to fully articulate, which is often how the most important moments work. "Perry Walker," she said, and the way she said it was nothing like the way a person says the name of an acquaintance they have run into by chance. It was the way you say the name of the place you are arriving at after a very long journey. "Stella," he said, and there was not much more he could manage at that particular moment. She stepped back and gestured for him to come in, and he did, and they sat in the 2 chairs that flanked the small window that looked out over the side yard where Martha's chicken coop stood. And for a while they talked about practical things, the journey and the stages and the condition of the roads, because sometimes you need practical things to hold on to while the larger feelings sort themselves out enough to be spoken. She told him about the last year. After Albuquerque, she had spent some months in Santa Fe, which she had loved with an intensity that had surprised her. The old city with its adobe buildings and its overlay of Spanish and Mexican and American histories all present at once, its markets and its bells and its particular quality of light. She had been offered a position there managing a dressmaking establishment for a merchant's family, a real position with real pay and real responsibility, and she had taken it seriously for several months before she had understood that taking it seriously was not the same as belonging there. Agnes was right, she said. "The woman who nursed me in Arizona. She told me to figure out if I was running toward something or away from something, and I thought for a long time that I was running toward myself. But eventually I understood that I was also running toward a place and a person." She looked at him directly, the way she had always looked at him, with that clear and unguarded regard that had undone him from the beginning. "I got your last letter," she said. "In Albuquerque the week before I left." He waited. "You said I was loved," she said. "That I had been loved for 5 years." She was quiet for a moment. "I sat with that for a long time, Perry. I did not want to come back to you just because you told me I was loved. I needed to know that I was coming back because it was what I wanted, not because it was what someone offered me." She paused again, and the late afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, and it was gold, and it lay across the floor between them. "And then I understood that those two things are not as separate as I thought they were. Wanting to be where you are loved, by a person you love, that is not weakness. That is just knowing where you belong." Perry looked at her across the small space between the two chairs, and he felt something in his chest open like a window. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been lighting a candle in the window every evening since you left," he said. "The east window. You left going east and I put a candle there and I kept it every night for 5 years." She stared at him. Something moved through her expression that was complicated and beautiful. "Perry," she said. "I know you told me not to wait," he said. "You were very clear about it. I want you to know that I understood what you were telling me and I respected it, and I was not waiting in any way that put a demand on you or created any obligation. I was just—" He stopped and looked at his hands for a moment and then back at her. "I was just keeping the light on," he said, "because some part of me could not quite make itself stop." Stella Bailey looked at Perry Walker for a long, long moment, and then she got up from her chair and crossed the small distance between them, and she took his face in her 2 hands the way you take hold of something precious, and she said, "You ridiculous, wonderful man," and she kissed him. He kissed her back with 5 years of patience, and 5 years of waiting, and all of the particular, stubborn love that had kept a candle burning in a window on the Kansas prairie through heat and cold and loneliness, and the slow passage of time. And outside the window of room 3 at Martha Gaines' boarding house, the town of Caldwell, Kansas went about its business in the late October afternoon, entirely unaware that something had just been resolved that had been waiting a long time to be resolved. When they separated, he was holding her hands and she was laughing a little, the way people sometimes laugh when what they feel is too large for any more appropriate response. "I need to tell you something else," he said. "There is more," she said. "I'm not a particularly exciting man," he said seriously. "I run a cattle ranch on the Kansas plain and I play chess on Sunday evenings, and I have 3 ranch hands who I am responsible for and a considerable amount of fence that requires ongoing attention. I'm not going to take you to San Francisco or Santa Fe. I'm not going to offer you mountains or oceans." "I know," she said. "I am offering you a flat gold horizon and a lot of work and the kind of life that is not extraordinary except in the ways that matter," he said. "And I am offering you that permanently and completely if you want it." She looked at him with those clear eyes and she said, "I have seen the mountains and the ocean and the desert, Perry Walker, and they are magnificent, but they are not home." She squeezed his hands. "You are home." He took a breath that felt like the first completely free one he had taken in 5 years. Martha Gaines, who had been listening at the foot of the stairs with absolutely no shame whatsoever, let out a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a small cheer, and then went into her kitchen to make a very good pot of coffee, because she felt the occasion demanded it. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Perry Walker's life to that point, and he was not a man given to superlatives, so that was a meaningful statement. Stella stayed at Martha's boarding house because that was the appropriate and respectable arrangement, and Perry called for her every morning, and they spent the days together in the patient and thorough way of 2 people who have been apart for 5 years, and are now in the business of catching up to each other. He showed her the ranch with the careful pride of a man, showing something he loves to someone whose opinion matters. The main house was a solid two-story frame structure that his father had built, and that Perry had improved over the years, with a covered porch on the south side, and a kitchen that occupied a full quarter of the ground floor because, in cattle country, the kitchen is the actual center of the house. The outbuildings were well maintained, the fences were sound, the cattle were healthy, and the land itself was beautiful in the particular way of flat country in autumn, the grass pale gold and the sky enormous, and the light at this time of year arriving at an angle that made everything look like a painting. Stella walked the fence lines with him and learned the names of the cattle, which were not individually named but which she began naming anyway, and Perry pretended to object to this on the grounds of professional cattle management, and then quietly began using her names himself. She helped Roy and Davis and Benito with the hay work one morning, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to, and she was terrible at it at first and then gradually less terrible. And Benito, who was not a man given to unnecessary words, said afterward to Perry with a nod of quiet approval, "She learns." Perry proposed to her on a Saturday evening in November, sitting on the south porch of the ranch house with a wool blanket across their laps and the stars beginning to appear above the darkening prairie. He had been carrying a ring in his vest pocket for 2 weeks, a plain gold band he had ordered from the jeweler in Wichita, modest and good, the kind of ring a practical woman might actually want to wear while working. He had been waiting for the right moment, and then he had decided that waiting for the perfect moment was something he had been doing quite enough of, and that a good moment would do just fine. He took the ring out and held it in the space between them where their hands were resting together on the blanket, and he said, "Stella Bailey, I would like to marry you. I know that is a considerable thing to ask a woman who has spent 5 years becoming who she is, and I am not asking you to be anything other than exactly that. I am asking you to be it here with me in this life. Will you?" She looked at the ring for a moment and then at him, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has arrived where she was going. "Yes," she said, simply and completely, without any qualification or hesitation. "Yes, Perry, I will." He put the ring on her finger, and she held her hand up and looked at it against the last light of the western sky. And then she turned and put her arms around him, and they stayed that way for a long time, on the porch of the ranch house with the cold coming in and the stars coming out, while the candle in the east window of the kitchen burned steady and warm behind the glass. They were married in December of 1883, in the small white church that sat at the end of Caldwell's Main Street, with its steeple painted fresh every spring, and its pews full of the town's families who had known Perry Walker all his life, and who had known Stella Bailey for a few vivid months, and then known her as an absence, and who now knew her as a return, which was in some ways the most interesting and complete knowing of all. Frank Dolan served as Perry's best man, and cried so thoroughly during the ceremony that he was obliged to borrow Martha Gaines's handkerchief, which Martha had brought specifically against this contingency. Doc Adler stood in the back with his arms folded, and the expression of a man who has been saying for some time that this would work out, and is now watching it work out with vindicated satisfaction. Stella wore a cream-colored wool dress that she had made herself over the previous 3 weeks, working in Martha's parlor in the evenings with a speed and precision that had impressed even Martha, who was not easily impressed in matters of construction. She wore her hair up with 2 small ornamental combs that had been her aunt's, the aunt who had kept the millinery shop all those years ago, and she walked up the aisle of that small church looking like a woman who was precisely where she intended to be, which she was. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Morris, who was a long-winded man in his sermons but who understood when brevity was called for, and he was brief and genuine, and when he pronounced them husband and wife Perry Walker, kissed his bride with a thoroughness that made the congregation laugh and clap and Frank Dolan resume his weeping. The reception was held at Martha's boarding house, which had been cleared of its regular furniture and filled with tables, and the women of Caldwell had contributed more food than 20 people could have managed, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a guitar, and there was dancing that went on until nearly midnight, which was late for a December night in a Kansas cattle town, and which spoke to the quality of the occasion. Perry danced with Stella until his boots ached, and then he kept dancing, and she danced with him and with Frank and with Doc Adler, who turned out to be a surprisingly capable dancer, and with Roy Sims, who was not but who was enthusiastic, and with old Creed Holloway, who had been the stage driver when she had first arrived in Caldwell 5 years before, and who had aged considerably but who still had the laugh that carried across 3 city blocks, and who said to her as they danced, "I always had a feeling about you too, right from that first day." "Did you?" she said. "The way he looked at you off that stage," Creed said. "A man does not look at someone like that and then just forget about it." She looked across the room to where Perry was standing with Frank, both of them laughing at something, her husband, this man who had stood in this town and kept a light in his window for 5 years because some part of him had not been able to let go of her even when she had told him not to hold on. "No," she said. "I do not suppose he does." The winter that followed was a good one, as Kansas winters went. It was cold and there was work, always work, but it was shared work now, the kind that fills a house differently than solitary work does. Stella took over the kitchen with an efficiency that impressed the ranch hands enormously, having learned to cook in that Arizona hotel, and having taken it seriously in the way that she took most things seriously. And Perry ate better than he had in 5 years, and said so frequently enough that she told him he was going to give her a swelled head. She also began to think about what she wanted to do with her time beyond the household work, because she was not a woman built for only that. And by February, she was talking about opening a dressmaking business in Caldwell, a proper one, not a millinery but a full dressmaking service, which she believed the town needed, and which she was qualified to run. Perry gave her his complete support in this, which was not a universal attitude among the husbands of Caldwell when it came to their wives' commercial ambitions, and she noticed it, and held it the way you hold evidence of a person's true character. By April she had rented the small storefront 2 doors down from the original millinery site, which was now a barber shop, and by May she had a business operating that by summer had more clients than she had hours in the day. The town of Caldwell was good to her, as it had been before, and she was good to it. She hired a girl of 18 named Clara who was quick with a needle and wanted to learn the trade, and she taught her with the same earnestness with which Carmen in New Mexico had taught her the embroidery techniques, because she believed that knowledge passed forward was one of the better things a person could do with what they had been given. Perry watched all of this with a pride that he could not always fully express, but which was visible to anyone who saw him looking at his wife in those days, which was a look of the same quality as the one Creed Holloway had noticed on that first day, only deeper now, deepened by knowledge and time, and the particular richness that comes from having waited for something, and then having it arrive and prove itself equal to the waiting. In the late spring of 1884, Stella told him she was expecting. He was sitting at the kitchen table when she told him, and he stood up from it immediately in the way of a man whose body has responded before his mind has caught up, and he stood there for a moment looking at her with an expression she would describe later as the funniest and most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face, and then he crossed the kitchen and took her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling perfectly well," she said, smiling at him. "Women have been doing this for the entirety of human history. I think I can manage." "I know you can manage," he said. "I just want to know that you are well." "I am well," she said, "and happy." "Are you happy?" He looked at her for a moment with all of what he felt visible in his face, this man who had spent 5 years keeping a candle in a window on the chance that the person he loved might one day come back to it, and he said, I am the happiest man in Kansas." "That is a fairly low bar," she said, "given the general disposition of Kansas men," but she was laughing when she said it, and he was laughing too. Their son was born in December of 1884, a healthy and emphatic boy who announced his arrival in a manner that suggested he had strong opinions about the process and wanted everyone to know it. Doc Adler was there, composed and competent in his professional way, and Martha Gaines was there because nothing significant happened in that household without Martha present, and Frank Dolan paced the porch outside for 2 hours and wore a groove in the boards with his boots. They named him James, after Perry's father, with the middle name of William after Stella's father back in St. Louis, who was still alive and who had received a letter about his daughter's marriage, an impending grandchild with a joy that had expressed itself in a letter so warm and so full of feeling that Stella had cried over it for an hour, and then written back a letter that she said told him everything, really everything, about the last 6 years and what she had found at the end of them. James Walker was a large and cheerful baby who slept well and ate enthusiastically, and who showed early signs of having inherited his mother's curiosity and his father's steadiness, which was a combination that seemed like it would serve him well in the world. The ranch hands were entirely disarmed by him. Benito Salazar, who had always seemed to Perry to be somewhat immune to sentimentality, was found one afternoon sitting on the corral fence with baby James on his knee, teaching him, in Spanish, the names of the horses, which James received with great attention, and then attempted to repeat in a way that produced more joy than it did intelligibility. Roy Sims made James a small wooden horse that first Christmas, carved over several weeks in the evenings by lamplight, painted brown with a black mane, and Perry watched his wife hold that carved horse and look at the man who had made it with a warmth that made Roy go red to his ears and study his boots. "Thank you, Roy," she said simply, and Roy said yes, ma'am, and went back to studying his boots, but he was smiling. The years from 1884 into the late 1880s were the years of building, in the way that good years in a life tend to be building years. Perry expanded the ranch carefully, acquiring a section of land to the north when it came available, and improving his water access so that the dry summers which came reliably on the Kansas plains were less of a crisis for the cattle. He hired 2 more hands, bringing the crew to 5, and the operation became genuinely prosperous in the measured and sustainable way that Perry had always aimed for rather than the aggressive expansion that had ruined more than a few of his neighbors who had borrowed too much at the peak of the cattle boom. Stella's dressmaking business grew into something she was genuinely proud of, a real enterprise that employed Clara and eventually a second girl, a young woman named Esperanza who had come to Caldwell with her family from New Mexico, and who brought with her the embroidery traditions that Stella had first encountered there, completing a circle that Stella found deeply satisfying. She was known throughout the county for the quality of her work, and she had clients who came from as far as Wichita, and she ran the business with the same clarity and directness with which she ran everything, fair to her employees and honest with her customers, and willing to say no to work that did not suit her standards. James grew from a baby into a small boy with bright eyes and a disposition toward questions, an enormous number of questions, which he directed at every available adult with the democratic confidence of a child who has never had an inquiry treated as unwelcome. Perry answered all of them as fully as he could, and when he did not know the answer he said so and suggested they find out together. And Stella watched this and thought that a man who answers his child's questions with honesty rather than deflection is telling you something important about himself. Frank Dolan, who had remained single and seemed entirely content about it, was James's godfather and took the role with a seriousness that included regular deliveries of candy, the singing of songs of dubious quality, and the instruction of the boy in the fundamentals of horse care from an age at which horse care was largely conceptual. Doc Adler, who had no family of his own in Caldwell, had become something like a beloved uncle to the boy, and his Sunday chess games with Perry had evolved to include James sitting on a stool between them, watching with intense concentration, and occasionally offering an opinion on the moves, which Perry and Doc received with more gravity than it perhaps warranted because the boy's instincts were, in fact, occasionally quite good. Martha Gaines, who had always claimed she was too busy to take a sentimental interest in other people's families, was James's de facto grandmother, in the way that a town's genuine matriarch becomes grandmother to the children she has watched come into the world, and she knitted him sweaters every winter and told him stories about the town's history and fed him pie on the afternoons when his mother sent him to town on errands that she could perfectly well have done herself, but which she sent him on because she understood that the relationship between James and Martha was good for both of them. In 1887, Stella became expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was harder than the first had been. There were 2 months in the middle of it during which she was sick in the mornings and tired in the afternoons in a way that was new to her, and Perry managed the household and the business, with Clara holding the shop together with a competence that made Stella tell her that she was getting a raise, and James was 4 years old and regarded his mother's diminished energy with a thoughtful seriousness and brought her things, cups of water and small interesting rocks he found in the yard, as offerings designed to help. Which they did, not because small interesting rocks cure pregnancy sickness, but because they are the sincere gift of a person who loves you and wishes he could do more. The baby arrived in March of 1888, and she was a girl, and they named her Ruth, and she was smaller than James had been at birth but perfectly healthy, and with a pair of lungs that Doc Adler said would serve her well in any profession she chose. James regarded his new sister with the mixed feelings of an only child suddenly required to share the world's central attention, and worked through this over the following weeks by being by turns helpful and aggrieved, which Perry and Stella handled with patience, and with the understanding that this was ordinary and would pass, which it did. Ruth turned out to be a child of considerable force of character, which surprised no one who knew her parents. She walked early and talked early and had opinions about everything, including which hat she wished to wear, which direction she wished to walk, and which of the ranch hands she was currently favoring with her friendship, a status that rotated on a schedule she determined, and that the ranch hands accepted with a combination of affection and slight anxiety. Benito Salazar was her particular favorite, perhaps because he did not talk down to her but spoke to her in the same measured way he spoke to everyone, and because he let her sit on the gentle mare he kept for light work and walk her around the corral, holding Ruth steady with one hand and the lead line with the other, while Ruth held the mane and looked at the world from this new height with an expression of profound satisfaction. The late 1880s brought changes to Caldwell, and to the wider region that were the continuation of the forces Perry had been watching and adapting to for years. The great cattle drives up the Kisham Trail were largely over by the end of the decade, replaced by the railroads that now connected the cattle country directly to the eastern markets, and Caldwell's identity as a cattle town was shifting. The town was growing, more families, more farms, more small businesses, and the wild edge that had characterized it in the earlier years of the decade was softening, which some people mourned and others welcomed, and most simply accepted as the passage of time. Perry had managed his ranch's adaptation well enough that he was not among those ruined by the transition, though there were hard years, 1886 especially, when a brutal winter took cattle across the plains, and Perry lost a third of his herd to cold that no fence or shelter could fully defeat. He had rebuilt after that, methodically, without panic, and the resilience of the operation was in part a product of the diversification he had been building toward for years, the leased pasture arrangements, the water investments, the hay production that meant he was less dependent on open grazing. Stella stood with him through the hard year of 1886 with a steadiness that was one of the things about her that he loved most, and that he was grateful for most. The ability to look at a difficulty with clear eyes and say what needed to be done and then do it, without catastrophizing and without minimizing, just with the direct and practical courage that she applied to everything. "We have enough," she said in the worst month of that winter, when the cattle losses were still being tallied and the numbers were bad. "We have this house and this land and each other and these children and these people." She had gestured at the kitchen table where James was doing his letters, and Ruth was doing what Ruth did, which was examine everything within reach with the attention of a scientist. "We will build it back." They had built it back. The candle that Perry had lit in the east window the night Stella left Caldwell had burned down many times over the years and been replaced many times, but after their marriage he had made a change to the habit without entirely abandoning it. The east window was still there, still faced the direction from which she had eventually come back, but the candle now sat in it not as the beacon of a waiting man but as something else, something they had talked about one evening in the second winter of their marriage when she had asked him about it. "Do you keep it there still?" she had asked, looking at the windowsill. "I lit it tonight," he said. "I do every night." She was quiet for a moment. "I do not mind," she said. "I want you to know that. I thought when I came back it might make me sad, that window, because it is a reminder of how long you waited and how long I was gone, and I am not entirely without guilt about that." "You should not feel guilty," he said immediately. "I know you feel that way," she said. "I am telling you how I actually feel, which is that I do sometimes. I wonder what those 5 years cost you." She looked at him. "I told you not to wait." "You did," he said. "And you lit a candle every night for 5 years," she said. "I did," he said. She was quiet again. "I think now," she said at last, "that what I told you and what you did were both right. I meant it when I told you not to wait. I did not want you to put your life in suspension for me, and I did not want to come back out of obligation or pressure. I wanted to come back if I came back because it was true." She looked at the window. "And you keeping that candle was not you putting your life in suspension. You built things, Perry. You built this ranch and this life and these friendships and all of it. You were not sitting still. You were just keeping a light on." She put her hand on his arm. "I think I was always coming back to it. I think some part of me knew it was there." He covered her hand with his. "Then I will keep it," he said. "Yes," she said. "But let it be a different kind of candle now, not a waiting candle. Just a light." "What kind of light?" he asked. She thought about it. "The kind that says someone is home," she said. He had liked that very much. A light that says someone is home. So the candle continued to burn in the east window of the ranch house. And it was not any more a candle of waiting, but a candle of presence, of occupation, of the simple and profound fact that within this house on this Kansas prairie, there were people who loved each other and who were home. James grew up with that candle the way you grow up with the familiar geography of a house, not noticing it because it has always been there, until one evening when he was 10 years old and had been helping his father with the evening chores. He came inside and looked at the candle and said, with the directness of a child who has been listening to adults long enough to have accumulated questions, "Papa, why is there always a candle in that window?" Perry was at the sink washing his hands, and he turned and looked at his son and thought about how to answer this. And then he sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Sit down, and I will tell you." James sat across from him, with the attentive expression he got when he understood that something real was being communicated. Perry told him, not all of it and not with every detail, but the essential truth of it, that before James was born, before Perry and Stella were married, Stella had gone away to find herself and to see the world, and Perry had loved her and kept a candle in the window every night because he hoped she might come back someday. And she had. And the candle was still there because now it meant something different. It meant that this was home, and that home was a thing worth keeping a light on for. James sat with this for a while in the way that 10-year-old boys sometimes sit with things, processing in a manner that is not yet visible on the outside. Then he said, "She came back." "She came back," Perry confirmed, Because of the candle, James asked. Perry considered this carefully. I do not think the candle is what brought her back, he said. I think she came back because she loved this place and because she was ready and because she was always going to come back when she was ready. But maybe he looked at the window, at the small, steady flame on the sill. Maybe it helped to know that someone would still be here. James nodded, apparently satisfied with this. Then he said, I think that is a good reason to keep a candle. And he got up and went back to whatever he had been doing, carrying this piece of his family's history into himself with the easy assimilation of a child who has been given a real and true thing and knows it. Stella had been standing in the doorway to the hallway, having come in from the parlor during the conversation, and she had heard most of it. And when James left the kitchen, she came in and sat at the table across from Perry in the chair her son had just vacated and looked at him with an expression that contained more than she had words for in that moment. You told him, she said. He asked, Perry said. She reached across the table and took his hand. You are a good father, she said. You are a good mother, he said. We are a good pair, she said. He smiled. We are, he agreed. Ruth's reaction when she eventually got the same story at age 8 was characteristically different. She listened to the whole account with her chin propped on her fists and her eyes bright, and at the end of it she said, Mama went away and came back and you had a candle the whole time. The whole time, Perry said. Ruth looked at her mother with an expression of frank admiration. Mama, she said, that is the most romantic thing I have ever heard. Stella laughed, the kind of laugh that fills a kitchen. I went away and made your father wait 5 years, she said. I'm not sure romantic is quite the right word. It is absolutely the right word, Ruth said firmly, and no one in the household was going to argue with Ruth when she used that tone. The 1890s brought Caldwell into a different era. The wild Cowton days were definitively over, replaced by a more settled community with a school that was properly housed in a dedicated building, a new church, a bank that had been there for some years but was now more firmly established, and streets that were beginning to get planks on the worst of the muddy sections. The cattle business continued, modified and adapted, and Perry Walker's ranch continued to be a functioning and profitable part of the regional economy, though the margin was tighter and the work was different from the open-range days of his father's time. He was 40 years old in 1894, and he was in good health and good spirits, a lean and weathered man with laugh lines around his eyes and gray at his temples that had come in gradually, and that Stella said suited him, which he took at face value because Stella was not a woman who said things she did not mean. He had built something solid and real over the course of his adult life, something that required nothing extraordinary to describe because its value was in its dailiness, in the way it worked and held and produced not drama but warmth. Frank Dolan had married at last, at the age of 42, a widow from the county seat named Patricia who had 3 children of her own, and who met Frank's considerable energy with a matching supply of her own, and who, in the opinion of everyone who knew them, was exactly what Frank had needed all along. The wedding had been an occasion of genuine community celebration, not least because Perry Walker served as best man for the 2nd time in his life, and this time it was Frank who cried and Perry who lent him a handkerchief, which reversed their positions from a decade before in a way that everyone present found enormously satisfying. Doc Adler was aging and had taken on a young assistant, a recent graduate of medical school from St. Louis named Harrison, who was cautious and competent, and who was clearly going to carry the town's medical practice forward when the time came, which Doc Adler regarded with a practical acceptance that spoke well of him. He continued his Sunday chess games with Perry, and James, who was now an adolescent with a genuine talent for the game, had begun sitting in as a full participant rather than an observer, and the 3 of them played long, serious games that ended with analysis and argument and considerable satisfaction all around. Old Creed Holloway had retired from the stage line in 1891, and spent his days on the bench outside the general store, offering opinions to anyone who passed, which people accepted because Creed was 90% reliable on matters of local history and human nature, even when he was wrong in detail. Martha Gaines ran her boarding house with undiminished efficiency and had officially become the town's institutional memory, the person you went to when you needed to know what had actually happened in any situation of note in the last 20 years. One afternoon in the late summer of 1895, Perry came home from the range to find Stella sitting on the south porch with a letter in her hand, and an expression on her face that he had learned to read over 12 years of marriage as the expression she had when something had touched her deeply. "My father has died," she said. He sat down beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat that way for a while without speaking because speech was not what was needed in that moment. "He was not a young man," she said finally. "He was 71. He had a good life. He died at home with my brother's family around him." She paused. "He never met the children." "I know," Perry said. "He saw the photographs," she said. "I sent photographs every year. He wrote to me that James had the look of a Walker but the eyes of a Bailey, which I thought was very precise of him." Perry squeezed her shoulder. "Do you want to go to St. Louis?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "The funeral will be long past before I could get there," she said. "He died 3 weeks ago." She folded the letter carefully. "I will write to my brother." She looked out at the prairie, which was golden and enormous and familiar. "I said goodbye to my father a long time ago," she said quietly. "When I left St. Louis the first time. He was not happy about it then, but he understood eventually, and he came to be proud of me, I think. His letters always said he was proud." She pressed the folded letter against her chest for a moment. "I hope he knew that I loved him and that I was happy." "You told him in every letter you wrote," Perry said. "He knew." She turned her face toward him, and he could see that she was not going to cry, not now, though there would be a different time for that, perhaps late at night when the house was quiet. "I am glad I am here," she said. "I am glad I came back." "So am I," he said, which was possibly the most complete understatement he had ever made in his life, but which she received as he meant it. James Walker left for college in Lawrence in the fall of 1899. Which was a fact that his parents received with a combination of pride and the particular hollow feeling that attends the departure of a child who is going toward his own life. He had been accepted at the University of Kansas on the basis of an examination that he had taken with a calm confidence that had made the examiner later remark to the Caldwell newspaper that the Walker boy was one of the better prepared students he had seen from the rural counties. He intended to study law, which had been his announced intention since he was 14 years old and which had never wavered, and Perry and Stella drove him to the rail station in the autumn of his departure and stood on the platform watching the train carry him away east with a feeling that was grief and joy together in proportions that kept shifting. "He will be all right," Perry said, as the train disappeared. "He will be extraordinary," Stella said, which was not disagreement. They rode home together in the wagon across the prairie in the October afternoon, and Perry's hand was on Stella's where it rested on her knee, and the sky was that flat, hard October blue, and the grass was pale gold, and the horizon was the horizon that Stella had compared to mountains and oceans and found superior, and it lay around them in every direction, enormous and known and beloved. Ruth, who had turned 11 that spring, and had the opinions of a person considerably older and the energy of several people her own age, kept the household from being too quiet after James's departure, which she managed without effort because she was constitutionally incapable of quiet for any extended period. She was beginning to show the signs of the person she was going to be, sharp and brave and direct, and full of an enthusiasm for the world that had not yet been moderated by the world's response to it. And Perry and Stella raised her with the careful balance of structure and freedom that they had worked out over years of paying attention to who their children actually were rather than who they had expected them to be. On a Sunday evening in December of 1899, the last December of the century, Perry Walker sat in the kitchen of his ranch house with the fire going and the light low and comfortable, and looked at the candle in the east window, the candle that had been a waiting candle and was now a coming home candle, and felt the fullness of his life around him in the way that only comes when you are quiet enough to notice it. Stella was in the parlor reading, and Ruth was upstairs with her lamp on, probably not sleeping yet but thinking the thoughts of a girl on the edge of becoming herself. And outside the prairie was dark and cold and wide, the grass flattened under a light snow, the stars very bright above the flat Kansas horizon. He thought about the evening in 1878 when he had first lit this candle, or one like it, a man of 26 with grain on his boots and a feeling in his chest that he could not entirely account for. He thought about the years of keeping it. He thought about the letter from Tucson and the letter from Socorro in the afternoon in October of 1883, when Frank Dolan had ridden out to the fence line and said the 4 words that had rearranged everything. He thought about the evening on this same south porch, when Stella had taken his face in her 2 hands and said, "You ridiculous, wonderful man," and kissed him with the full weight of 5 years of absence behind it. He thought about James and Ruth, and the ranch hands and Frank and Martha, and Doc Adler and old Creed Holloway, and every other life that had touched and shaped and enriched the life he had built and shared in this place. He thought about what Stella had said about the candle, about it being a light that says someone is home. Someone was home. He was home. The door to the parlor opened and Stella came into the kitchen in her wool house dress and sat down across from him with a book still in her hand, her finger marking the page, and she looked at him with the look of a woman who has looked at a man for 16 years and still finds what she sees interesting, and she said, "You have that look." "What look is that?" he said. "The one where you are thinking about something large," she said. "You get very still." "I was thinking about the candle," he said. She looked at the window. "What about it?" "Just that I am glad I kept it," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the warm light of the kitchen, this man who had loved her with a patience and a steadiness that she had not always deserved, and had come back to because she had known, from the plains of New Mexico and the streets of Santa Fe, and all the other places she had passed through looking for herself, that this was where she was found. She set her book down on the table, finger still marking the page, and she reached across and took his hand. "So am I," she said. Outside the kitchen window, the candle burned in its steady and unhurried way, a small flame against the enormous dark of the Kansas prairie, saying what it had always said in this form or that through all the years. Someone is here, someone is home, someone has kept the light. The century turned and the light was still burning. James wrote from Lawrence in January with the news that he had finished first in his class examinations, which Perry read aloud at breakfast, and which Ruth received with the fraternal combination of pride and competitive irritation that siblings have always carried for each other's accomplishments. Ruth announced that she intended to finish first in her own class examinations when the time came, and then went about the day with the air of a person who has set a task for herself and intends to complete it. By spring, James sent a second letter saying that he had met a young woman in Lawrence, the daughter of a professor there, named Helen, and that he thought Perry and Stella ought to know about her because she was going to be important. Stella read this letter at the kitchen table and then looked at Perry across her coffee cup with an expression that was pure delight. "He writes exactly the way you talk," she said. "Is that a concern?" Perry said. "It is a comfort," she said. "It means I will understand what he is telling me." Helen came to Caldwell the following summer, a serious and warm young woman from a bookish household who looked at the ranch and the prairie with genuine curiosity and not a trace of condescension, and who spent 2 weeks asking questions and listening to answers with the same quality of attention that James had always brought to learning. Ruth decided immediately that she approved of her, which James received with visible relief. Perry and Stella liked her with a completeness that required no deliberation. James married Helen in Lawrence in the autumn of 1901, in a ceremony that his parents attended with the joy of people who recognize that their child has made a genuinely good choice, and that the world is therefore going forward in a hopeful direction. Frank Dolan attended as well, because Frank attended every significant event in Perry Walker's life with the faithful regularity of a man who has decided that friendship is a practice and not just a feeling, and he cried again, which was by this point simply Frank's established contribution to occasions of emotion. Perry and Stella came home from Lawrence on the train, sitting together in the passenger car with the Kansas landscape moving past the windows in the October light. And Stella slept for part of the journey with her head on Perry's shoulder, the easy trust of a woman who is completely at home in the presence of the person beside her. And Perry looked out at the flat land going past and held her hand, and did not need anything more from the world than what he had. When they arrived back in Caldwell and he helped her down from the platform and they walked toward the wagon where Roy Sims had come to collect them, she looked toward the western edge of the sky where the sun was setting in a long line of amber and orange and said, "It is good to be home." "It is always good to be home," Perry said. She leaned against his arm for a moment in the gathering dark, and in the direction of their ranch, a mile and a half across the flat prairie, the east window of the kitchen was dark because no one was there to light it, and Perry thought that tomorrow evening he would light it again, and it would mean, as it always meant now, that someone was home, that this house on this plain was occupied by people who had chosen it and loved it and each other, and that the light was not waiting for anything except the ordinary miracle of another day. Ruth came home from her school that winter and declared that she wanted to go east to study, to one of the colleges in the east that were accepting women now, and Perry and Stella had a long and honest conversation about it. And the conclusion of that conversation was yes, because they were people who understood what it meant to a young person to need to go and find themselves, and they were not going to be the obstacle to their daughter's becoming who she was. She left in the late summer of 1903, at 17, older than most girls who made such journeys but not the oldest, and she went with her mother's quality of courage and her father's quality of steadiness, and a trunk full of sensible clothing, and 24 of Stella's embroidered handkerchiefs, and a letter from Benito Salazar in Spanish that she could read perfectly well, having learned the language from him over years of afternoons in the corral. A letter that said that she was brave and good, and that the horses would miss her and so would he. She wrote faithfully and came home for summers and grew into the person she was always going to be, a teacher and eventually a principal, a woman of considerable force and considerable warmth, who married a man from Ohio at 24 who was neither overwhelmed nor diminished by her, which was the correct response, and brought him home to the Kansas ranch in the summer of that year and let him meet her parents, who received him as they received everyone, with directness and with hospitality. Perry Walker was 50 years old in 1904, and he stood on his south porch in the morning of his birthday with a cup of coffee and looked at the land that he had known his whole life and that had known him back, and he felt the satisfying weight of a life well lived pressing gently against the inside of his chest like the warmth of a good fire. Stella came out with her own cup and stood beside him, and she was 48, and she was beautiful in the way that a person is beautiful when they are completely and genuinely themselves, when the outside has been shaped by the inside over many years of true living. And Perry looked at her with the same quality of attention he had brought to looking at her since the day she appeared on the afternoon stage in Caldwell, a quality of attention that had not diminished with familiarity but had deepened with it. Because familiarity with someone you love does not produce indifference but a finer and more precise knowledge of the thing you love. "Happy birthday," she said. "Thank you," he said. "What do you want?" she asked. As a birthday request. He looked at the prairie, at the big flat sky with its morning clouds, at the fence lines running away to the horizon, at the cattle in the far pasture, at the corral where the horses moved in the early light. He looked at the house behind him, solid and permanent and full. He thought about all of it, the full and actual content of this life. "I have everything I want," he said. She looked at him for a moment with all the complexity and warmth of 21 years of love in her expression. "That," she said, "is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." He turned and smiled at her, this man who had stood at a feed store on a dusty Main Street in 1878 and watched a woman ride into his life on top of a stagecoach, who had loved her and let her go, and kept a candle burning in a window through 5 years of patient and stubborn hope, who had been standing in his life when she came back to it, and who had built with her in the years since something that was stronger and truer than anything he had imagined when he was a young man who did not yet know that some things require years to become what they are. "Well," he said, "I had good material to work with." She laughed and leaned against him, her cup warm between her hands, and they stood together on the south porch in the birthday morning as the sun climbed above the flat Kansas horizon and lit the prairie gold from end to end. And behind them in the kitchen, the candle in the east window sat quiet in its holder, not lit at this hour, waiting for evening, when Perry Walker would light it again as he always did, the small and faithful flame that said, in the language of constancy and home and the enduring fact of love, that he was here, that they were here, that this was the place where the light lived and where it would always be kept burning.